Welcome back, people, to our series on Hegel's lectures on the world history. We are now finally starting his chapter or section on Persia. We've made our way through China and India, and we've explored what historical significance Hegel finds there are in these nations and cultures on the progress towards freedom and self-consciousness. And today we'll be looking at what significance Persia has in that story.
Yeah, and Hegel starts very optimistically with Persia in his introduction, where he writes, with this empire, the Persian Empire, that is, we enter for the first time into world history proper. So one wonders what we've been doing for so long, but
Yes, apparently the last 12 hours or 18 hours, however many episodes we did, was just like a prelude.
yeah,
But that's just typical Hegel, isn't it?
yeah, it is. Um, but he quickly explains what I think he means, and this is probably something that's worth dwelling on a bit. The the logical development that he sees Persia representing. Um, and so the reason why Persia or the Persian Empire is granted this great moniker of, you know, being the beginning of world history proper is that its history is actually directed outwards. It has an influence, an external influence. It influences the peoples around it in a way that China and India did not for Hegel.
Yes.
And it seems to be, and we've said this often, I think, in our discussions on China and India, that Hegel puts quite a lot of value on the outward relations of a peoples or a nation. Being insular sort of condemns you to be kept outside of world history.
Yes, and this is also the place where he explicitly says it's an empire. He doesn't think India and China qualify as empires in quite the same way.
Yeah, the reasons for that are also very interesting. Um, because he goes on to write on that topic. Yeah, he says that here we see, I'm quoting Hegel here we see a unity of ethnic groups persisting in their autonomy, and yet dependent on a point of unity that held them in equilibrium and could keep them content. So Hegel is really putting emphasis on, I guess, what he considers to be a balanced expression of difference in identity or difference in unity.
Hmm.
And you could always you can always say that in China there's difference in unity, in India there's difference in unity in various forms, but I think at least in this preliminary sentence, what Hegel is saying is there's a greater representation of difference in the Persian Empire insofar as you really do have these ethnic groups that persist somewhat autonomously, right? So they've all got, if my classic history is correct, all these little city-states have their own monarchs, their own sort of leaders, and they all take their small independent decisions, but they're all fundamentally held within the orbit of the Shah,
Yeah.
the king, the king of
Isn't it
kings,
the King of Kings? Or did
the
that come
king.
later?
No, the king of kings is from this time.
Right. Yeah. That so as far as Hegel is concerned, that seems to be a big step in terms of the development of the state here. That it's a unity of different peoples and cultures, much more so than what he thought was the case in India and China. So it's interesting we have unity of difference, but also sort of outwards expansion, you might say, sort of outwards determination. So
Mm.
it's not content being bound by certain geographical areas. It wants to, by its nature, sort of expand and incorporate more bits into itself. I guess
Yeah.
that's why it makes it an empire.
And I think here we see an echo of Hegel's more abstract philosophical interests. Um, and I'm reminded of a very early section in the Logic. I can't remember exactly where it was. I think it was maybe Being or Nothing, where Hegel sort of gives a critique of purity, that there can be an idea of a category of thought that can be pure, as in detached from other categories of thought. And Hegel, obviously, he's not that kind of philosopher. He doesn't believe in purity. There's no such thing as purity as the pure separation of one thing from another. And here you can see that he finds this expression in for the first time in world history in the Persian Empire. And it's nice to see that that sort of philosophical affinity between his more abstract metaphysical work and his work here, where he's looking in more world historical matters.
How do you see purity played out here?
No, exactly. I don't. That's precisely the point.
Okay.
So it's maybe I didn't express it correctly. What I think is interesting is that the same philosophical concerns that Hegel has in something like the Logic, where he wants to show that this idea, this philosophical notion of purity in categories is misleading. Uh, so too in world history, he puts a premium on the the nation, the peoples who exemplify that idea.
Right. Yes.
There's a lot of critique of China and India for their inward lookingness, and part of that, I get the feeling, is connected to Hegel's general disapproval of a philosophical conception of things that treats them in isolation to other things, and that treating things in isolation somehow elevates them.
Yes.
And
And it also makes them sort of accept their own contingency,
hmm
right? So
Go on.
China is just the place where China happens to be. That's the land, the area. Same with India, right? Um, there are ways in which nations can found themselves to just identify with their surroundings, but that would be a contingency for Hegel because, well, if you were born some other across the globe, then you would find that to be your identity, right?
hmm
And that's kind of a mark of unfreedom. Uh,
Right, yeah.
so the geography can only be a starting point. The reason why I think China and India do elevate themselves above that is precisely because they inaugurate organizations and states and culture and so on, which is why we've discussed them and why they're part of these series. And yet they are not proper, explicit, um, sort of, they don't inaugurate world history proper.
Yeah.
So we are kind of looking at those world historical states from the vantage point of world history already being developed. But if we abstract away from our current standpoint and just zoom in on them, we would never have world history.
Right. Because they don't influence things beyond themselves.
Yeah,
And so they don't sort of influence development.
not in principle, right? And I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
issue of principle is what is at stake here.
Yeah.
There's something not innately within their culture or state, the way it's organized, that sort of influences itself outwards, determines things outwards.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's clearly something that Hegel thinks happens for the first time with the Persian Empire. And then we have this really nice paragraph, which makes me sort of breathe a sigh of relief. we sort of come back to the domain of logical development and depart from the bizarre TripAdvisor domain that I sometimes find myself in these lectures,
Yes.
where Hegel writes, um, we have then to indicate this is the final paragraph of the section, the principle of the Persian Empire.
Okay.
We have then to indicate the principle of this empire. It is the unification of the preceding principles. That's a
Yes.
very familiar move, right?
Yeah.
The third is the unification of the previous two. In Persia, the Chinese Indian principles are united. In China, there was the unification of the whole under the dominion of an external moral will that determined a person's innermost will. The principle of the Indians, on the contrary, was that of absolute distinction set in stone by nature. In the Persian Empire, we see the distinction of individualizations as nations too, and indeed in such a way that the distinctions are given free rein and yet overcome, held together by a point of unity. So here, free individualization reverts into a point of cohesion. This is the third necessary element. I think, his choice of the word individualization is very interesting. He's, because if we just take a step back, the role that Persia seems to play here is kind of like the role that Dasein plays in the logic. You sort of have pure being and pure nothing and becoming, which are sort of like these sort of they're so immediate, they're so intangible that they almost don't really count as beginnings. Um, and then you finally have Dasein, determinate being, and you're like, oh, okay, we've got something now that we can actually
Well, hold your
build
horses,
on.
not something.
No, we don't have. God, I can't even speak.
No, you can't.
But at the same time, so you might think that sort of works, Persia, India, China, India, Persia. But then at the same time, he's got this universality, particularity, individuality,
Yes.
sort of conceptual structure playing in the background. So you feel when you're reading this that it's a heavily layered development that he has in his mind um, of world history, and it's a shame that you don't see it more often.
Yeah. And that he doesn't spend very much time, at least here, in expanding why
Yeah,
or how. So, okay, it's the unification of the preceding principles, but how? How is the Indian principle, expressing itself in the Persian principle? How is the Chinese principle being expressed in the Persian principle? We can make guesses, you and I,
yeah,
but I guess we won't really know until we've read the rest of the section.
yeah, exactly.
But I assume the Chinese principle is the bureaucracy.
The bureaucracy, the role of the king, I guess, as well as the point of unity, maybe,
Yeah, yeah.
because if I remember that, like the Indian prince didn't have that point of cohesion in the same way that the Chinese emperor had that point of cohesion for China,
Hmm.
and I suspect the Persian emperor, the King of Kings, plays that role as the point of unity.
Yes, in a much more totalizing sense.
Yeah,
Uh,
right. Totalizing because it encompasses the difference, the different the different ethnic groups.
well, I would say it's a kind of supremacy not only of politics or the authority of the king, but also religious authority, God's authority. So it's all like smashed into one position. Whereas maybe in the Indian one, you had more dispersed authorities. No one had one authority overall. You had the priesthood, the monks, they had a
Yeah,
very heavy
different
religious
castes.
authority. The princes didn't have much religious authority, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right.
So one has to ask, is that the case here, where the Persian king is religious, um, head, well, the head of the priesthood as well as the head of the state.
Yeah. I think we should just agree to just refer to the Persian king as the king of kings always.
Right. Yes.
We've got the Chinese emperor, the Indian princes, and the king of kings.
But okay, so what then is the Indian principle? How is that being expressed?
Superficially, I would say it has to do with the fact that, as in the Indian Empire or the Indian continent, in the Persian Empire, you have all these different groups that are part of it, that compose it. But instead of just being disparate groups that are not unified by anything, here they are cohered within
Hmm.
a single unity.
Yes. And so the addition to this logic is that they are cohered, but they are but as they are. So their
Yeah,
individuality is supposedly not effaced in the face of the unity or the universal.
yeah,
It's supposed to allow them to express themselves as the individual people, culture, whatever region, autonomous bit of the empire you have.
yeah, exactly. Which I think echoes a lot of contemporary historiography on the Persian Empire. It's sort of seen as this like a bizarrely enlightened kind of empire where sort of everyone has their day in the sun. Like, you're sort of you're allowed to sort of continue doing what you're doing, but you got to pay your what is it called? You got to pay your it's not taxes, the specific word for what they were used for what they anyway, you got to pay tribute. You have to pay your tribute
Right.
to the King of Kings. Um, but yeah, so that's I think covers the Persian principle.
So far, initially, yes, in its immediacy.
Yeah, and its immediacy.
Uh, Another small detail is the fact that Hegel mentions that while he thinks that the Indian and the Chinese worlds still sort of persisted to his own day,
Mm,
version one is long gone.
yeah,
There's this weird temporal line that goes into the world history as
yeah,
well as a logical line,
yeah,
which is can be confusing and murky.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good point to pick up on. On that same thread, he sort of makes a big deal about the fact that unlike with India and China, we've got fewer sources for the Persians,
Yeah.
and he somehow connects that to the fact that that is because they are more outward looking. So he writes,
He writes.
yeah, I was trying to find it because I wrote the note.
Anytime, sir. Whenever you're
Yeah,
ready.
he writes, the materials pertinent to the Persian Empire are, however, largely incomplete. Skip a bit. Although China is an important essential element, it lies outside the connections of world history, as also does India, the other element, which has only a mute, silent, inner connection that passes by inconsequentially. We've already talked about that. With Persia, however, there is in fact a conscious and clear connection. And then he goes on to talk about how what makes Persia different is that we know more about their external matters than their internal affairs. So we know a lot about what the Persians did to other people, but we know and we know relatively less about how the Persians dealt with themselves.
Yes.
And there seems to be, at least in the way he's presenting the material, or at least in the way the person who has written this presenting the material, there seems to be some kind of connection in Hegel's mind between the fact that they were an outwardly looking, the fact that they related to externality in a way that China and India didn't, and the fact that we have few sources about how they conducted their internal affairs. Um,
Yes.
it's almost as if, yeah,
Please go and finish.
it's almost as if the richness of evidence in China and India and the poverty of evidence in Persia is testament to the fact that the former were very isolationists and so sort of self-referential in their sources, whereas the latter, who are much more, let's say, expansionist, it's not the right word, but more ex outward looking, were less self-referential. And that's why what we know about them has to do with what they did to other people rather than how they related to themselves.
Yeah. You did mention another thing, I think, in the passage you read, something along the lines that Hegel says that we have a greater connection to Persia than we have with India and
Yeah,
China,
yeah,
such that the world that Hegel lived in is sort of um, has a closer lineage to Persia than it has to India and China, such that the reason we don't know very much about the Persian Empire, or you know, it's it's because it was supplanted, it was replaced, it no longer exists because of something. It was like something
mhm,
came over it, and so that means it was forgotten. Whereas the same thing did not happen to China and India. They sort of kept on going. They were not overcome by or supplanted by something else,
yeah.
and therefore not forgotten. So I wonder, this is speculating,
Mm,
I wonder if that's the case with why we know so little about Persia inwardly.
yeah. And I wonder if what you would think about adjusting slightly the phrase they were forgotten to they forgot about themselves.
Or we forgot about ourselves, strictly speaking, because Persia is
Yeah.
a primordial version of ourselves, of our own society.
Mm,
So, insofar as the society takes on new forms, it can do so insofar as it forgets the older form or discards it.
mm.
And
So what
yeah,
we're saying is a very bizarre picture actually of philosophical development in world history, whereby you have like these two isolated nations, ethnic, whatever you want to call ancient China and ancient India, who are pertinent in the development of world history, but because they don't externally influence each other and Persia, they sort of stand outside of it in a way. And Persia is almost our world historical ancestor,
yes.
even though China and India are really our ancestors, and so in the sense of the beginning of statehood
Hmm.
and organization, and yet because of the way of the logical structure of those states, they don't, I don't know, they don't feel like our ancestor because logically they are. They are the sort of the first m moments.
Yes,
Uh,
but in an implicit way.
yeah. Okay, in an implicit way.
Yeah, so as we said earlier in the episode, you would not get world history from China or India alone.
Yeah.
Some other kind of state needs to develop that combines their principles, that then starts to develop the world history concept explicitly.
Yeah.
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 And so there is a kind of distance that happens between Persia and India and China,
Yeah.
a necessary sort of um, estrangement.
Yeah.
They become strangers.
I mean, it makes the transition from India to Persia kind of substantive.
Mm.
It's an important transition, that move. In a way that the move from China to India, again, a bad analogy, but it kind of the way we're talking about it, it kind of feels like the vanishing of being nothing. Whereas, because there's something intangible about the move from China to India.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas the move from India to Persia, or China and India to Persia, suddenly becomes more concrete.
Yeah.
Or it leads to something more concrete out of something that was initially quite abstract.
Yes.
Um,
That is what has to be at the back of Hegel's mind,
yeah,
analyzing and thinking about these things.
yeah. Okay.
Well, I think we need to ask ourselves an important question,
Yeah.
whether empire is necessary fate of world history. So empire is a recurring theme throughout history in general, and many people and nations attempt it, and usually they all sooner or later fail.
Yeah.
The project of empire isn't sustainable.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, it seems that like here in Hegel, we find that it's a necessary moment in the development of world history.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of phase we got to get through, maybe, in order to then figure out a better phase, a more coherent and rational place.
I think we have to go back to this idea of difference and unity, um, as this important logical step, this necessary third element that Hegel sort of arrives at with Persia. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what are the kind of political organizations that could encapsulate this concept? We could probably come up with a few. Empire definitely seems to be one of them. And historically, obviously, the earliest kind of, right? The earliest form of uniting difference uh, into a whole whilst maintaining the difference, the integrity of the difference.
Yeah.
Obviously, in our modern societies, we would want to say something very similar, right? That we are the whole that contains within itself difference.
Yes.
Um,
Although empires have that tendency to be aggressive and
hmm,
deny its neighbors their freedom, basically, right?
yeah. Can you have a pacifist empire?
Probably not.
Hmm.
And is the case that empire is necessary in the development of world history? In other words, necessary in the development of freedom, because that's kind of what's at stake here, I think.
I don't know whether the answer is empire as such is a contingent feature of world history, and what's necessary is the manifestation of some kind of political structure that is this cohesion of differences,
Hmm.
or whether the much more strong point that empire. Because I wonder how Hegel would. Now I'm actually wondering how Hegel characterizes modern society.
Hmm.
Maybe he doesn't characterize modern society as the cohesion of differences.
Well, it
Because, I
can't
mean,
be that alone.
no, it can't be that alone. But also, I mean, obviously, our societies, Norway, maybe Norway less. You guys are quite homogenous, but in the UK at least, even though obviously vastly large numbers of different ethnic groups within a single nation, Is it the same as the different ethnic groups in the Persian Empire? Not really, because they've got a degree of autonomy as an ethnic group that I would think is greater in a sense than the degree of autonomy that an ethnic group has within a modern nation.
Hmm. Maybe.
But
That's a,
that,
that's
but,
an
but
interesting
then,
question.
but then, on the flip side, that greater degree of autonomy also comes with a greater degree, I suspect, of subservience.
Yes. Like absolute authority lies with the King of Kings,
Mm,
and the kings he picks are the satraps to manage the domains.
yeah, like you can
So
have
the
your own. Please go ahead.
no, I was finished.
I was going to say, like, you can have your own moral customs, you can have your own laws,
Yeah.
you can do
They
whatever you
have their
like.
own gods.
But when the King of Kings says this, it's this.
Have your own
And that
gods. Everything is fine. But when I want to put the cupboard over there, it goes there.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that is simultaneously a greater degree of autonomy than what I think we currently have, but a greater degree of subservience.
Which is a really intense,
Yeah.
nice sort of contradiction.
It's really intense, right? It's
Yeah.
like
It's
both sides are like put to 11 and they're just
yeah.
like
Well, it's like how it was back in the ancient days, right? When they were
yeah.
doing war, it's like all out, boys. And when they were going for tranquil peace things, they built great temples, had great art, and so on. It's just 11 all the time in all directions.
But maybe actually to go back to your point about empires being necessarily violent or expansionist, maybe this is why. Because they've got that hyper contradiction built into them.
Well, they've got two principles that are essentially incompatible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the only way to resolve it, not the only way, there are lots of ways to resolve it, but eventually, now and
Well,
again,
eventually, there's really only one logical way to resolve it.
yeah. So maybe the answer is that empire is necessary, yeah.
Hmm. Well, I am not ready to commit to any either way. I
Yeah,
want to learn more of what Hegel thinks,
yeah,
but
absolutely.
I think, a pertinent question, and I would like
Yeah,
to have it answered.
yeah, it's a very good question, Philip. Yeah.
All right, should we call it there?
I think we should, and
Yeah.
I can't help myself. I have to say it. The next two sections are just awful.
Did you read ahead?
I did read the geography of ancient Persia and the Zen people language and books. Very interesting historically. I'm sure one can learn a lot about what people in Hegel's time thought
Right.
about these things, but there is nothing in there philosophically.
Yeah. You mean not the religion of light?
No, no, no,
Oh
no.
no, that's next week. Okay, yeah.
That's
I
next.
agree with you. I read those
I'm
two and it
hoping.
was
I'm
like,
hoping that will be much richer.
yeah. No, I read those two and that was like there was nothing there.
Yeah. So that's why we're skipping over. That's why we're not talking about them. Just so everyone is aware
Yeah.
why we're not talking about them. It's not because they're sort of they're silly, but because they don't really contribute to what we're primarily concerned with, which is tracing the logical philosophical development of
Yes.
the idea in world history.
Yeah. Figuring
Okay.
out what's at the back of Hegel's mind
Yeah.
about these
But
things.
yes.
Okay, very good. Thanks,
Thanks for that.
people,
Yeah.
tuning in.
Discussion.
Leave us your questions and comments. I would like to hear from you what you think regards the questions we've raised today about what the Persian principle is, how it incorporates these other principles, and a question about empire. Is it a necessary step in world history?
Yeah.
Right then.
Fantastic.
See you next time.
Bye.